And that is the Havdallah Prayers starting out, sung by Nathaniel Hirschtick and the Maccabees. A good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. We're coming out of Shabbos with joy. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we start this new week? Let's see. Gil Erez. Ask me a political question. This is a 100% non-political show. Christo with us, wishing a Shavua Tov and a meaningful Yom Kippur. Sharon with us from Lebanon, New Jersey. Bill says Shalom. Chana Rivka, Shavua Tov. Sandy says Michigan is in the house. Maria with us from Indiana. Lindsay with us. Where are you from, Lindsay? In the Midwest, as I recall. Naju is with us from Bangladesh. How awesome. Welcome, Naju. Liam says something in another language. I'm sorry, I can't read. Bo Forrester says Shalom. Ilana with us from South Africa. Linda Levitt Westberg is with us from Jackson, Wyoming. Is that it for now? And Franco Bonaparte says Shalom. And over on the YouTube side, where I think we're having delays, and maybe that's why I don't see any comments over there. Haven't for the last few days. All right. Let's see where we are as we head into this new week. We are in a 7.5-year journey through the Talmud. We're in volume 3, the third tractate of the Talmud, Eruvin, the laws of the Shabbos boundaries and the enclosures in which we can carry on Shabbos. We are on Daf Mem Zion, that's page 47. We're in chapter 4, and we're discussing the fourth Mishna of chapter 4. Recall the flow of information that we're in. We've been discussing the specific kind of Erev, which is the Erev Techumin, that we're gonna move boundaries, or we're gonna establish a boundary, how far a person can walk on Shabbos. The rabbis, the sages, established that the limit is 2,000 cubits in any direction from our Shabbos dwelling. If one dwells in a city, he can walk throughout the city and then 2,000 cubits more once he leaves the edge of the city. Recall that we've discussed many times how you can move that circle, as it were, to another place in case you need to go in that direction because you want to hear your favorite rabbi give a lecture, and he's going to be further than 2,000 cubits in that direction from where you dwell on Shabbos. So you can move your dwelling either by depositing a basket of food before Shabbos that contains 2 meals worth of food, or by walking in that direction and establishing your Shabbos dwelling with your feet at the beginning of Shabbos. With regard to acquiring this Shabbos dwelling, so now we've talked about how it's normally in our house, but we can move it with this basket of food or by being at a certain place with our feet. What if we're on the road, we're traveling? Okay, so the place where you are, you're establishing it with your feet, that you're going to establish that as your Shabbos dwelling. You're going to have 2,000 cubits in any direction from that spot is how far you can walk during Shabbos. But we had the case of a person, a traveler, let's say, who was asleep when Shabbos began. So he was in a fixed place. He wasn't on the move. If you're on the move when Shabbos begins, that's its own difficulty. This person was stationary, but he was unconscious. He was asleep. So the sages asked the question, did he establish a Shabbos dwelling for himself? If he did not establish a Shabbos dwelling, or if he was outside what would have been his Shabbos dwelling, so then he doesn't have 2,000 cubits in any direction. He's limited to the 4 cubits around him. He has to stay where he is. When this question was asked, we had a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who said the sleeping person acquires a Shabbos boundary of 2,000 cubits in any direction, just like an ownerless object acquires 2,000 cubits in any direction. The first part of that, he acquires a proper Shabbos dwelling, and he can move in 2,000 cubits in any direction. It was Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri up against everybody else. Right? The rabbis who disputed Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and specifically Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehuda, had slight nuances on the other opinion. But generally speaking, the majority, everyone lined up against Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and said, no, you only get the 4 cubits. You were asleep. You didn't establish a Shabbos dwelling. But the law came out that sages later established that the law, the halacha, accords with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. How do we know that? Because Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who's a great authority, said the law in this situation, the law, the halacha, accords with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri over the opinions of the other sages. But Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi didn't stop there. He said the law accords with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and the law accords with the lenient opinion in this case of Eruv. Now, Yochanan ben Nuri's opinion was definitely the lenient opinion. According to him, you can walk 2/3 of a mile in any direction. You're free to move around like a regular person on Shabbos. According to the rabbis who dispute Yochanan ben Nuri, including Eliezer and Yehuda, you would be limited to those 4 cubits right where you are. That's certainly the more stringent opinion. But why did Yehoshua ben Levi have to say both? Both that the law accords with Yochanan ben Nuri and that it accords with the lenient opinion. And from the fact that he said both, we learned a whole bunch of principles the last time we were together, yesterday, Friday at noon. Now, and then at the end of yesterday's class, we saw that among the principles that were learned out from the fact that Yehoshua ben Levi had to say both that the law accords with Yochanan ben Nuri and that it accords with the lenient opinion in the case of Eruv, we learned that there are certain decision-making principles which seem to apply most of the time, and some say all of the time. And so what did we see there? That in disputes between... So first we saw, generally speaking, right, if there's a dispute between one person and the majority, we're going to follow the majority. But we also saw that with respect to rabbinic decrees, there's also, we're going to show favor toward the lenient opinion, right? Because rabbinic decrees were sort of layered on top of Torah laws, and it's to protect us from coming to violate Torah laws. But the rabbis aren't going to become overly strict about their own decrees because they recognize that their decrees are to protect us from violating Torah laws, not to layer on and on top more laws. Their laws are only to help us fulfill our obligations and avoid violating prohibitions that are in the Torah itself. Also, we learned that when there's a case of Rabbi Akiva versus one other sage, where Rabbi Akiva and one other sage disagree, the law accords with Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Yosei disagrees even with multiple sages, the law accords with Rabbi Yosei. When Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, disputes with one other sage, the law is going to follow Rabbi. When there's a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, the law is going to accord with Rabbi Yehuda. When there's a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, the law is going to accord with Rabbi Yehuda. And then Rav Mesharshiya said, no, these principles cannot be relied upon. And that's what we're going to examine today. Can these principles, this idea that generally speaking, when it's Rabbi Akiva versus one other guy, or Rabbi Yosef versus several, or Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Shimon, that the law comes out with Rabbi Akiva, with Rabbi Yosef, and with Rabbi Yehuda? Is that a principle that we can rely on? That's the question we're examining in today's daf. Now, the daf is going to give a series of examples of all different areas of the law, but what they all have in common is that these principles are going to be violated. There's going to be a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, and the law is going to be according to Rabbi Shimon. Or there's going to be a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and another sage, and the law is going to be according to the other sage. Or it's going to be Rabbi Yosef and someone else, and the law is going to go the other way. Or there's going to be a dispute that proves this rule. In other words, it's going to be Rabbi Yosef versus somebody else. And then the teaching is going to say, and the law accords with Rabbi Yosef. Now, if these principles are valid, why does the law why does the Mishna or the Brisa have to say, and the law accords with Rabbi Yosef? Didn't we just learn this principle that when it's Rabbi Yosef versus somebody else, the law accords with Rabbi Yosef? Why did the Mishnah have to tell us that the law accords with Rabbi Yosef? The fact that it tells us that, does that indicate that actually Rav Mesharshiya is right and those principles don't apply? Because if they did apply, all the Mishnah would have to say is, and Rabbi Yehuda says go like this, and Rabbi Shimon says go like that. And then we would know, well, then the law must be like Rabbi Yehuda. It doesn't have to say, and the law accords with Rabbi Yehuda. So that's going to be the tenor of these examples. I'm not going to spell out every single example because it's we'd be going in all these different directions, all different kinds of law. The thing that's important to understand is the question that's being asked over and over again is Rav Mesharshiya correct that these principles can't be relied on? That we can't rely on this idea that Yosef is always right over everybody else, or Yehuda is right over Meir, or Yehuda is right over Shimon, or Akiva is right over anyone else. That's the question that keeps being asked. So the question is going to be asked, and I'll just tell you where the examples are being drawn from, what kinds of laws are being discussed. So it's the case of a private city that became a public city, right? Like a town that was owned by the developer, and then it became a public place owned by its citizens. Or an eruv chatzeros, an eruv of joining courtyards so that people can carry there. That includes a homeowner who's absent on Shabbos and whether that eruv still works. Or, one example is a case like this. Let me see if I could show you this. This is a case, where'd it go? Of 3 courtyards, like this. Okay, so you have 3 courtyards, and the outer ones are going to join each separately with the inner courtyard to make an eruv, so that, for example, the people who live, this is all backwards to me, the people who live in this courtyard can carry objects in and out of this courtyard, and the people who live in this courtyard can carry objects to that courtyard. And likewise, they make an eruv from here to the middle, and therefore the people in the middle can carry to there, and the people out there can carry into the middle. But there's no joining of courtyards between the outer ones. And because the outer ones didn't join in a courtyard, they can't carry an object from the outer ones to each other, bypassing the middle courtyard, as it were. This is the law according to Rabbi Shimon. People can carry from the outer ones into the middle courtyard, from the middle courtyard into the outer courtyards, but you can't carry something from one outer courtyard through the outside on the street and into the other outer courtyard. That's what Rabbi Shimon says. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with him. I forget what Rabbi Yehuda says. It's not spelled out actually here. Maybe you can't carry at all between these courtyards because the outer ones did not join in an eruv with each other. There's not one eruv to connect all 3 courtyards. Clearly, that's how they should have done it. That would be the normal way to do it. But they didn't do it that way. For whatever reason, separate Eruvs were made between the two pairs, the middle and the one outer, and the middle and the other outer, and that does not join all three. So in any case, whatever was that Rabbi Yehuda's holding was, the law is according to Rabbi Shimon. Normally, the law would be according to Rabbi Yehuda in any dispute with Rabbi Shimon. So thus the Mishnah teaches that the halacha accords with Rabbi Shimon, and then therefore the principle does not. So therefore we have an exception to the principle. Okay, other examples that are going to come, that are going to be brought, where either the principle doesn't work or the principle does work, and the Mishnah says that the law is according to the one that we would expect. And since the Mishnah has the need to spell it out, it seems like, well, then the principle cannot be relied on because the Mishnah needed to spell it out. And the Gemara will say in every case, okay, we don't have a proof that the principle works because the Mishnah spelled it out. Other cases include the fact that both a pauper and a wealthy person may establish an Eruv with their feet. It used to be thought that, okay, only a poor person does that because he needs to do that, but the rich person is not allowed to do it that way. He has to use the basket of food. But actually, the basket of food was because everyone can establish an Eruv by being at a certain place when Shabbos falls. They establish it with their feet. The basket of food was a convenience so that the rich person wouldn't have to do that. A woman who was widowed or divorced needs to wait at least 3 months before getting married again. And this is to make sure that if she then gets pregnant right away, that the child, it belongs to the new husband and not to the old husband, as it were, the one who died or was divorced. And there's going to be some differences among the sages of in which cases this applies. Specifically, if there was a case where a couple was betrothed but were never physically together, does she actually have to wait in case he dies and then she wants to get married again? Why wait 3 months? She was never with that man physically. But the sages, some of the sages say, no, you have to wait anyway because we don't want to make exceptions for tough cases. Better to have one general law that applies to everybody. So these are going to be areas of disagreement where the Gemara is trying to prove that the principle works or doesn't work. Another area, a Jew may enter a fair of idolaters, right? Like a flea market, a place where they buy and sell things, but it's owned by idolaters who are engaged in all kinds of practices where like a Jew should just not go. But a Jew is permitted to go there because he needs to protect his business interests, right? Like this is a place where if he doesn't go, he could incur substantial financial losses because he's not protecting himself. Buying and selling horses or camels or whatever was going on in the ancient world, it was necessary for him to go there or risk losing having a financial loss to his property. So then it's permitted to enter that fair, and we're not going to be concerned that he's going to somehow engage in idolatrous practices or even give the appearance that he's engaging in idolatrous practices simply by entering such a fair in order to protect his business interests. By the way, as I'm speaking, I'm saying a Jew may enter, a Jew may not enter, a Jew can go here, a Jew can go there, and lately, because the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was laying in state in the Capitol and was the first Jew to appear that way in the nation's capital. The newspapers say she was the first Jewish person. And that's pretty common parlance, in newspaper reports these days, where like non-Jews don't want to refer to a Jew as a Jew. They will only say a Jewish person. I think this is interesting and a little bit troubling. I know that people are saying, it feels wrong to say a Jew did this, a Jew did that. We should say a Jewish person as a way to be more polite. Okay, I understand and I appreciate the sentiment that is behind that. But where that really comes from is a history of anti-Semitism where like the word Jew was understood by non-Jews as some kind of an insult. There's the verb, don't Jew me down, which means don't negotiate for a better price, or just the noun to call someone a Jew is like somehow some kind of an insult. So that's tragic and historically, I guess there's a reason for it. But I don't subscribe to that form to that use of the word Jew in English, right? I'm very proud to be a Jew. We should all be proud who are Jews to be Jews. And if you're not a Jew, you're entirely welcome to refer to me as a Jew, because I'm a Jew. A Jew is what we call ourselves. And in Yiddish, it's a Yid. Which all just means a Jew in the language of Yiddish, and it's also something we're very proud of. And that word also was used as an insult historically in America, tragically. But I am a Yid. I am a Jew. I'm proud to be that. You can call me a Jew or a Yid, and you don't have to refer to Jews as Jewish persons. I hope I've been clear about that. Continuing, and by the way, if you have comments or questions, feel free. I'm nearing the end of tonight's lecture. Actually, it's a short one, and then I will address comments and questions. Okay. Another example where there was a dispute among the sages. A Kohen can enter a field where a corpse may have been buried and plowed over, which would mean that once it was plowed over, unfortunately, like bits of the body, the skeleton might have been scattered around that field, and therefore there are bits of corpse in that field. It's possible. They don't even know that for sure, but it's possible. So an Israelite, in other words, a Jew who is not a priest, can enter such a field. But a priest, a Kohen, should not enter such a field because they are held to a higher standard of sanctity. But the law is that if the only way to go learn Torah from the teacher that you want to learn from is to cross such a field, then the Kohen may cross that field. That's the teaching. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, no, if there's a Torah teacher available where the Kohen is, then he may not cross such a field. And likewise, a Kohen may leave the land of Israel. Now, in ancient Israel, it was assumed that the areas where dead people were buried or could possibly be buried were well marked because there were Kohanim, priests in the ancient land of Israel, who could not enter such areas. But once they left the borders of Israel, there was the other nations of the world were not marking such areas, so they had to assume that any place outside the land of Israel could possibly have that sort of corpse impurity that would lower the sanctity of a priest, and therefore he shouldn't leave the land of Israel unless there's exigent circumstances. And the question was, is going to learn Torah from a teacher you want to learn from an exigent circumstance? And so, for example, once the Romans really started to oppress the Jewish community in the Holy Land, most of the outstanding Torah scholars were located in Babylonia, in Bavel. So if you wanted to really get a first-rate Jewish education, you actually had to leave the Holy Land and go to the Jewish community in Babylonia, to places like Pumbedisa or Sura or Nehardea. But then you would have to cross these other nations. And the question was, could a priest do that in order to learn Torah? So it was Rabbi Yehuda who said, well, if he has a Torah teacher where he is, no, he shouldn't leave. He shouldn't take that risk and lower his sanctity. But Rabbi Yosei said, if he wants to learn from somebody, he's permitted to go learn Torah from that person, because not everybody merits to learn from every teacher. In other words, you should seek the best Torah teacher for yourself. If you're listening to me now and you think that I'm boring and you're uninspired, then you should seek out somebody else who's going to teach you Torah and inspire you and touch your heart and give you more wisdom and knowledge so that you get more connected to the Torah and to God. And you should seek the best teacher for yourself. So that's what Rabbi Yosei said. And Rabbi Yochanan said, and the law accords with Rabbi Yosei. Why did we need Rabbi Yochanan to tell us that the law accords with Rabbi Yosei? We already have that principle, that when it's Rabbi Yosei versus anybody, the law accords with Rabbi Yosei. If that principle is valid, why did Rabbi Yochanan have to tell us that the law in this case accords with Rabbi Yosei? One reason is that this teaching about leaving the land of Israel or crossing a field where there may be a skeleton that was buried and plowed over is not a Mishna, but rather is a Baraisa. So the Mishnas are more they're from the same period, the Tanaitic period, right? The Mishnaic period, the teachings of the sages from the late Second Temple period up through about the year 200 of the Common Era. But the Mishnas are more authoritative than the Baraisas. So we might have thought that, okay, this principle of Rabbi Yosei versus anybody, Rabbi Yosei, the law is according to him, maybe that applies to Mishnas. How do we know it applies to Baraisas? So maybe that's why Rabbi Yochanan felt the need to tell us that the law accords with Rabbi Yosei in this case. But generally speaking, does that principle hold or not? And after going through all these examples that I just spelled out what kind of laws they were, not the whole analysis for each one, but after analyzing each one, the Gemara finally concludes that those principles are generally valid, but not everybody subscribes to them, and gives the example of the great sage Rav as somebody who does not subscribe to those principles. He says you have to take each case and analyze it carefully until you figure out which way the law holds. You can't just know because it was Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Meir, or because it was Rabbi Yosei versus Rabbi Yehuda. You have to analyze it. But generally speaking, these principles are valid. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. And what's great, I think, is, that the sages are always looking for these underlying principles that sort of create a flow and an expectation and, sort of higher principles that unite laws from different areas. And I love that, and they love that, because when you see principles at work that unite seemingly unconnected laws, and by the way, this is something that we should look at not just in Jewish law, but in the law of any nation in which you happen to reside, right? When you can look at laws in totally different areas, maybe criminal law and traffic law, or the law of theft in an armed robbery, and the law of theft when it comes to tax evasion. And then when you look at those laws and how they're applied, and you can see that there's common principles that apply in both those disparate situations, well, then you're getting closer to, what is the heart and soul of the nation that has such laws. And since all our laws were given to us by God, through his Torah, dictated to Moses, who wrote it down on God's behalf, so when you understand principles that connect laws, you're getting a little bit closer to understanding the will of God. And that's what the whole Talmudic process is about, trying to understand, what does God want us to do in every aspect of our lives? Let's look at comments and questions. Sharon Frant Brooks, I'm a little confused. If you are traveling and staying at a hotel, do you need to actually announce that your hotel room is your Shabbos dwelling, or is it understood that you are staying there and that it is naturally your Shabbos dwelling? So it's a great question. It is, you don't have to say it. You don't have to declare it for a couple of reasons. Number one, you checked into that hotel and probably you were awake as Shabbos fell. Certainly it was in your mind that when you checked into that hotel and you were going to be staying there for Shabbos, it was clear in your mind that that was going to become your Shabbos dwelling. You didn't, like let's say candlelighting is at 6 p.m. on Friday, and you were just traveling down the road, and at 4 o'clock you were just so tired, you sat down just to take a rest, and you fell asleep, and you wake up and it's dark, and you're like, oh my God, I don't even know where I am. I didn't intend to make my dwelling here. I wanted to get a lot closer to the city or enter it, and I just fell asleep. So that's the situation that Yochanan ben Nuri was talking about. But even in that situation, he acquired a dwelling, right? Where even though he was asleep, he acquired that dwelling where he was. But and why did he do that? On account of an awake person would acquire a dwelling. In other words, the sages definitely take seriously the idea of what would be your intent if you had the chance to think about it. What was your intent when you check into a hotel room where you're going to spend Shabbos? For sure, it was to establish your dwelling in that room. Yosef Shum, is it true that these favorable opinions that were lenient are usually in the line of Rabban Gamliel? No, they're not usually lenient, right? the principle of usually being lenient is that with respect to rabbinic decrees, they're usually going to be lenient. And with respect to Torah laws, they're usually going to be stringent. But there's going to be exceptions to those rules as well. In terms of, who is in the line of Rabban Gamliel, I mean, Rabban Gamliel is descended from Hillel, his son, Shimon ben Gamliel, and then Gamliel II. I mean, they're going to be the Nazis. But I'm not aware of any trend among, the descendants of the Nasi to be more lenient. Certainly Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who was a descendant of Gamliel, is not, he's not always lenient, for sure. He's not always lenient. So I'm not aware of such a trend, but if you learn more, let me know. Lynn in Texas. I am on Talmud Bavli Eruvin Daf 48 today with the all Daf op. Will you be doing a double header one day to catch up or stay back? Just curious. Right, I allowed myself to fall back one day. We're one day behind the sort of international Daf Yomi schedule. Lots of Daf Yomi groups get behind, sometimes much more than one day. I purposely went back a day because I have I'm blessed, and there's some really beautiful, wonderful teachers even in my area. I actually don't study in person because I don't want to be indoors with other people, but they have a Zoom, and I can learn with them live because I know them personally. And I like, sort of hearing it from a very experienced Daf Yomi teacher. Now, these kinds of Daf Yomi classes, or on all Daf, if you listen to somebody teach, like if you don't have a lot of background, it's almost impossible to follow them because they mix so much Hebrew and Aramaic into their teaching that, like, when I started in 2005 and I didn't have that background, I didn't know what they were talking about. I did it on my own for 3 years with Art Scroll, and then I had sort of gathered enough of the concepts and language that I could follow. But at any rate, by being a day behind, because they're a day behind, sometimes I sit in on their classes, I hear how they express certain things, and then I can teach it. So yeah, at some point, but I realize that the way I prepare to teach is sort of not the way that they're teaching. So, at some point I probably will do the double header and catch up again. But I'm not planning on it right now. For now, we're just going to stay a day behind. Now we've got Yom Kippur coming up. But it's a one-day holiday, so I'm probably... Okay, so tomorrow is Sunday. I will not be teaching at the regular time, which would be 6 p.m. on a Sunday night, like all weekdays. I'm probably going to do noon, like a Friday schedule tomorrow, because Yom Kippur begins tomorrow night. And then I will teach, with God's help, after Yom Kippur ends, after I eat. And end the fast. So we won't fall behind there. But then Sukkot is coming up. So we're going to have a 2-day holiday at the beginning of Sukkot, 2-day holiday at the end of Sukkot. So there, unless I do some double headers, we'll fall even further behind. I haven't quite decided exactly how I'm going to handle that. We will, I believe, do some double headers, but I don't have a plan right now to get fully caught up. I think we're going to remain for now one day behind. Okay, if that's all, I'm not seeing any other questions. So, my pals, wishing you a very good week. We're on trial right now. We are in the midst of a heavy trial, right? The period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, every soul in the world is on trial. We received our initial judgment for the coming year on Rosh Hashanah. But it's like the judge wrote the decree, but didn't release it. It hasn't been announced yet, right? It won't be released, it won't be sealed until Yom Kippur. So this is the last night, tonight, and then tomorrow, right before Yom Kippur begins tomorrow night. This is a time to really examine our deeds. There was somebody that, we had kind of an argument in the last year, and I really felt I was right and he was wrong. And so then I thought about, should I apologize for my part in that disagreement? And I thought, I didn't do anything wrong. But then finally, a couple days ago, I just said, you know what? It doesn't matter whether I was right or wrong. The friendship is more important. And, I reached out to him and apologized. I didn't say anything like, I'm sorry that, when you were a jerk, I was a jerk too. I just said, I'm sorry that I didn't behave the way I should have in our interaction. And I left it at that. And what did it lead to? Then he apologized for his part in the disagreement. And now this thing is behind us, and the friendship is whole and intact. So these are the last days for that. If you have somebody that you think maybe I should apologize, so just do it. It's so worthwhile, and don't make it a phony apology like I'm sorry you feel this way. That's not an apology. I'm sorry you felt bad when I said such and such. No, I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for what I did. That's an apology. So I encourage everybody to make those reach outs now. May you be blessed to have not only a great decree from Rosh Hashanah, but that it should be a great decree for health and prosperity and joy and meaning in the coming year, and it should be sealed with all that goodness. A good vach, Shavua Tov. May you have a good week and a good gebenched yar, a year of blessings coming to you in this new year, 5781 on the Hebrew calendar.